What's our next move? You tell me. Gotta get off this rock, Chuck. Get back to the mainland, whatever the hell's going on here, it's bad. Don't worry about it, they're not gonna catch us.
That's right, we're too smart for them.
Yeah, we are, aren't we?
All right, everybody, welcome back to another week of Muskies on Tap. I'm one of your hosts tonight, Gus Manty of Suggs Fishing Guide Service. You may not exactly be able to hear it, but I'm a little under the weather, so apologies on the possibly a little bit more nasally voice. So I'm going to keep it brief here, but we'll explain our guest here shortly. But let's introduce the other hosts on here tonight. None other than my brother Max. Max, how you doing?
Doing great. Doing fantastic. Yeah, awesome interview we just had. Hope you guys enjoyed that. Not much for me to update here. Still middle of winter, still not musky fishing. So everything else is good. Work's been busy. But yeah, no, it's had a good weekend. Excited to be back on the mic here this evening. And with that said, without further ado, let's introduce our third member here, Mr. Brian Eckel. Brian, how are you doing this evening?
I am doing just great. I was sick, week and a half, 2 weeks ago now. So Gus and I
Yep.
back to back, dropping like flies. Max, you're next. Be on the lookout for that.
Appreciate that, brother.
Yeah, no fishing on my end. I was down in beautiful big Texas this past weekend. A little work event down there. Got out to lash a few balls on Sunday in like 43-degree weather, so it wasn't kind of that hot southern US that I was hoping for, but still had a great time. Good to get outside. Um, but yeah, unless you guys got anything else to touch on, we can fire up this interview because I learned way more than I thought I'd learned tonight in the pod. It was awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, Gus, who do we have on this week and what were we trying to do here?
We got Jordan Weeks on of the DNR, and he was really gracious to give us his time to just chat about everything that we've had questions about. You know, he's got nothing to promote or anything. He's just a really passionate musky angler, you know, nonetheless, apart from, you know, working for the DNR for a really long time. I think he said, you know, in the mid 20-year range. And we cover a broad variety of topics that I was, you know, really happy to dive into and get answers about. And, you know, we even chatted a little bit off recording, and we probably could have him on to talk even more about, you know, studies of tagged fish and stuff like that, you know. But we're really excited to bring you this podcast, and I hope that everybody enjoys this. So if you guys got nothing else to add here, we'll just fire up the interview with Jordan Weeks. So hope everybody enjoys it. All right, here on the end of the line, we got Jordan Weeks with the Wisconsin DNR, and we are really excited to have him on here. Going to chat up some more fisheries biology, basically getting, you know, real answers about these fish that we ever so love to chase, the muskie. So, Jordan, you've been on numerous podcasts before. I've listened to you before, but maybe just give the listeners a little quick background, kind of who you are, introduce yourself, just so that we kind of, you know a little bit about you.
Thanks. First thing, I'd like to just thank you guys for having me on. I always appreciate the opportunity to talk muskies. So it's really a important thing to me to do. So thanks for having me on. I've been working for Wisconsin DNR for over 20 years. I got 25 years in or so. For a majority of that, I was the muskie team leader for the state. And the muskie team basically is a group of scientists that works on muskie policy. For example, we're some of the folks that develop some of the rule change proposals that come out from year to year and from time to time. My title is Mississippi River Supervisor. I work on the Mississippi. I live in La Crosse. Spend a lot of my time in northern Wisconsin fishing muskies and I've fished muskies for over 30 years. So I got both aspects of the science part and the fishing part covered.
Right on.
Sweet.
Well, sounds like you're going to be the right guy to steer us in the right direction. I think before we started recording here, we were kind of talking about how we've touched on a lot of these different aspects of not only the musky fishing side of things, but just like how to take care of these fish and all that stuff, but we've never really had a true expert on per se. So I'm gonna hit you with this question to start off, and I feel like it's gonna be a tree. We'll branch off from there. But in your opinion, what do you think the state of musky fishing is like in Wisconsin right now, particularly?
Sure. In my opinion, and I've said this in multiple places, that musky fishing has never been as good as it is right now in the state of Wisconsin and in the country. Muskies have been, stocked all over the place. So the muskie range has increased. You can now fish muskies in southern states. It's not just up north, and it's not just an opinion that I say that by. Every metric that we have, every metric that we use in the department, as far as maybe not numbers per se all over the place, but definitely the number of large fish being caught in the range is increased over time. That number kind of bears out when you look at some of the Muskies Inc. data. If you've ever looked into that, I spent quite a bit of my time analyzing some of that data. I've actually done some presentations at the Milwaukee Muskie Expo. I believe that was 2019. I did a presentation on kind of the state of muskie fishing and compared Wisconsin to a bunch of other different places and how things are going there. But, you talk to, I guess it depends on who you talk to, but by our metrics and by my, opinion, I think musky fishing has never been better.
Right. I mean, by sheer numbers, it kind of does seem that way. I mean, of course, there's some would say, there's an increase of musky fishing people in general. The pressure has increased. Probably the intelligent pressure, some would say, has very much increased. So the average angler is probably catching more than the average angler did, maybe even just 10 years ago, as opposed to longer than that. Because, I've heard stories from guys way back in the day that say it was, significantly better back then, but, I never got hard evidence of number of fish caught and like that, just it sounded like fish maybe were dumber, but maybe the fishing wasn't quite as good, maybe that's what I'm trying to say. Um, but yeah, the number of people have increased, so yes, the number of fish have increased, but it's good to hear. I mean, the stocking has been pretty good in the I don't know when, kind of like the mid-range of the 2000s, 2010s and stuff like that. And then I know there's, some people, some shakiness when 2020 there was no stocking and the cutbacks and stuff. And I know I've heard you mention this. This was multiple years ago about the what was that being passed on the walleye initiative, where basically there needed to be more room for walleyes to um, grow in these hatcheries. So it kind of took over some room for muskies. Is that changed at all since I've last heard?
I mean, you covered a lot of ground there in the last, few sentences. I guess we could start talking about stocking if that's where we want to go. In the past few years, the numbers of fish stocked is kind of is reduced. When you talk specifically about the walleye initiative, that began in like 2008 ish or nine. Don't quote me. It's really close to those 2 years is when it
Mm-hmm.
started. And what the deal is with that is it's actually mandated in state law that we produce X number of walleyes, these extended growth walleyes, to stock around the state. And that was dictated by the legislature. Muskie stocking probably reached its peak in the late 80s. And when I say peak, we're talking in 1989, 88, 89, and before that, there were way more fish stocked, but they were much smaller on average. And so most of the fish stocked prior to 1987, let's just say, were fry, and generally fry don't survive very well. So it's a really nice feel good thing. Hey, we stocked 1 million walleyes, or excuse me, 1 million muskies. That feels great, but 1 million fry muskies don't amount too much in terms of survival, or fish that can be caught by anglers. So we switched over to extended growth, or not extended growth, but large fall fingerlings in the late 90s, where we asked our hatcheries to produce fish that are at least 11 inches long in the fall. And so when you think about that in terms of growth, that means those fish typically the eggs were being stripped in May. Those fish were in the hatchery basically May, June, July, August, and were coming out in September. And they were coming out at 11 inches. In a lot of cases, they were coming out at 12 and a half inches. And in order to get them that big in that short amount of time, nature usually doesn't do that. We really pumped the live minnows to those fish. And, when they came out of the hatchery at that point in mid-September, they have shoulders on them and they're 12 inches long and they look like they're going to survive. And so that was a huge change in our philosophy, our stocking philosophy, in switching from, a fry stocking, let's 15 years earlier, to this large fall fingerling stocking. And we did that as a result of multiple research projects that showed the larger fish you could stock in the fall survived better. And so, yeah, if you want to talk about pure numbers, if we go back in the day, the old timers will tell you, oh, they stocked more fish, but that didn't mean there was more fish to be caught. And I guess to backtrack a little bit to what you started out talking about was like the perception of, some folks and how fishing was, and the rise in technology and, gear. Just from the time that I've been fishing, 30 years or 32 years or so, the technology and the equipment we're using is light years better. I can still remember a day when I used to live up by you guys, or up by Gus anyway. I lived up there from 99 till about 2005. And even before that, I was in college and we were fishing up that way. And I remember using Cortland master braid, or Cortland, some terrible Cortland line that would just fray nonstop. You'd have to change it all the time, and 6-foot rods that were like pool cues, and just straight trash when it comes to musky gear. And now it's changed so much. The knowledge base is so much greater. You have, podcasts like yours that are, disseminating fishing information to folks that are free, and it's great to listen to, and you can pick up tips. Even old dogs can pick up new tricks. Like I was talking before, I listened to a couple of your episodes and picked up some tricks from some folks, which is really cool. But, when you talk about the quality of the fishing and the expertise of our anglers these days, I think all those things go into it. So I totally understand if there's somebody that says, oh, I don't think fishing now is as good as it was 20 years ago, right? That's their perception, right? Perception is reality to everybody. And I mean, I could show them numbers that say maybe that's not the case, but in a lot of situations, what we see with our eyes is what reality is. And sometimes data doesn't trump that.
Right.
So I got a question on, like, when you stock these large fingerling, just kind of the thought process behind it, how that, the stocking bay equipment works. Because in my head, I'm thinking, wouldn't you want to stock these 12-inch fish like in April, in May, and let them kind of grow all summer in like the warmer water instead of putting them in before ice up? I mean, how does that whole system work, and how do you decide like that schedule?
Great question. And one I don't think that I've discussed in podcasts in the past. So thanks for asking that. It's really a logistical and timing thing, right? So muskies spawn in the spring. That's when we get the eggs. And the reason we get rid of them in September, and now we kind of push it back to try to get it to the 1st of October, is a twofold. First of all, if we keep them in the hatcheries, we have to keep the ponds full. We have to keep them from freezing solid, and we have to feed these things all winter. And to do that, just financially, it's not cost effective. And our facilities, our major musky hatcheries, are both in the north, and it would make it almost impossible to keep those ponds from freezing. They're only 5-6 feet deep. And, if you get a hard winter, you'll get 4 feet of ice and everything will be dead. So we couldn't really keep them in those hatcheries. The Art Emke hatchery in Woodruff, and then the Thompson hatchery in Spooner are the two major ones that do muskies for the north anyway. We now do them also at Wild Rose. Those are mostly Great Lakes fish. But logistically, it just doesn't work out to hold them till April. Now, if you can, and we do that in some instances, we have a Kiwani facility that we have the ability to keep those fish alive on the winter. Those fish, the feed for those fish is also the funding comes from a lot of musky clubs, the Green Bay clubs, Titletown. They'll pay for forage for those fish, and we historically have kept them over winter. We call those extended growth, and then we would stock those out in the springtime. That does give them a better opportunity to survive. But it's very, very costly. And, we averaged usually, not last year, but the years before that, we averaged somewhere around 80,000 muskies statewide that we stock these fall fingerlings. And to put it in perspective, we only would be able to keep about 2,500 of those fish to stock in Green Bay over winter because of the cost and because of the logistical difficulties about the winter.
Okay, that's what I figured, but it's good to know.
So while we're on the stocking topic, something that's kind of obviously like come through probably a lot of people's feeds over the past couple months is this DNR budget cut, and it's gotten people extremely riled up. I come from a law background where typically reading headlines doesn't get you very far as actually understanding what the issue is and everything like that. It's really easy to read a fiery headline and kind of kind of give your opinion from that. But I think and this is a genuine question because I don't know. What does that all entail? What does that mean for stocking for muskies going forward? Like does there need to be a solution? B, if there is a solution, how do you get there? Because I think from what I've talked to other people about, it seems like it's a hot button thing. People are frustrated by it. And I have no clue. So it's like, if there is an issue, what's the best way to address it kind of going forward? And is there an issue? I'd like to hear it kind of from you and your take on that.
There's absolutely right now in fisheries, there is a budget shortfall. Our funding comes mostly from fishing license sales and the federal excise tax on fishing and hunting gear. So almost all of our money comes from those two sources, right? And Wisconsin generally, on average, sells about 1 million fishing licenses a year. The part that really has exacerbated this problem is the fact that for at least 18 years, I think it's 19 years now, we have not had a fishing license fee increase in the state of Wisconsin. So your fishing license today costs the same amount as it did like 20 years ago. And, you guys are pretty young. I don't know if you remember buying stuff 20 years ago. I certainly do. You can't buy now what you bought then for the same amount of money. So like,
try to buy a house these days compared to 6 years ago.
Oh, please don't do that. That's a terrible conversation to have.
Yeah, let's stick
I'm
to
glad
fishing.
I got in a while ago, but
let's stick to fishing.
Yeah. It's the same principle though, right? Because your dollar doesn't go as far now as it did, 20 years ago. To put it in a muskie perspective, I believe it was last year or the year before, our minnows, we buy a gallon of minnows to feed muskies. And don't ask me how many muskies a gallon of minnows feeds, because I don't know. I'm not a hatchery guy. But a gallon went from like $23 a gallon to $60 a gallon in the same year. So we had all these fish in our hatcheries. We had budgeted for a certain amount of minnows to feed these things at $20 a gallon, 23, whatever, $20-ish. And then all of a sudden the brokers are like, nope, now they're $68. And so when your income is basically flat because you haven't had an increase in license sales, which is our main funding, we have had a few bumps here and there with the federal dollars that come in with the excise tax, but that's not enough to make up the shortfall from this static license fee. Okay, so that would be one mechanism. If we had the ability, and when I say we, the department has been pushing for license fee increases the whole time. Unfortunately, we're not the ones that get to make those decisions. That's done in Madison. So we continue every year to ask for that, and it hasn't happened. I'm pessimistic that it will happen soon. So then what's our alternative, right? You have X number of dollars to do your job. We already, muskies, and I'll say this quietly so the walleye guys don't hear us, but muskies already get a disproportionate amount of our budget based on the number of anglers in the state. So we think there's a lot of musky guys, and when you're out there in the weekend on the Eagle Chain, you think there's a lot of musky fishermen. But overall, when you compare them to other fishing groups like bass anglers or panfish anglers or walleye anglers, there aren't that many of us, right? So if we just had to rely on the money that musky anglers provide or would add to the budget, we would even stock fewer fish. So one answer is raise license fees, right? That would help. That would get us closer to where we needed to be. But I think at this point, we'd have to raise it to so much to make up for that inflation during the course of that time that people would freak right out. I would pay whatever, like personally, because I value the resource and I use it. And, you know, when you buy a fishing license, it's something that you can use 365 days of the year, and you can get food to feed your family. So it's about the cheapest form of like buying anything. It's cheaper than just about anything when you think about it that way. It's less than a half a penny per day currently. So the other mechanism could be that we get funding out of the state budget that would be taxpayer funded. Now, the good part about not being taxpayer funded is that when someone comes up and yells and says, my tax dollars, I don't want you doing that, I ask them if they buy a fishing license. And if they say no, then I don't work for them. I work for the people who buy fishing licenses. So if it were to go the other way, then I would be beholden to those taxpayers as well. And I would have to listen to them, which I don't really care. I'll listen to anybody. But but like that's another mechanism that we could make up this shortfall. So the biggest reason that there are fewer muskies being stocked today than there have been in the last 20 years is funding. We just don't have the money to grow the fish that we have been growing. And it's really simple economics. If we had more money, we would try to stock more fish. Now, having said all of that, we've also done a lot more research on the number of fish stocked in each individual water body. And we've also become better at fine-tuning that number to not stock too many fish so that we maximize growth rates, but yet still provide an acceptable fishery for guys to use, right? So if you look at our fish catch data, so we do these things called creel surveys, and we've been doing them for a long time, since the treaty unit, or since like the 80s when the treaty started. Back then, it took about 100 hours to catch a legal muskie, and the legal muskie back then was like 32 inches or something. And now we're somewhere closer to about 40. So if you just use that metric alone, fishing now is better. It only takes you 40 hours to catch a legal muskie. Plus, the legal muskie size is larger. It's 40 inches. So fishing, if you look at those two numbers just flat that way, muskie fishing is way better now than it was then. So that was a long answer to your relatively short question. So sorry about that.
Oh, it's good information because I mean, I kind of want to make 2 points because the first one isn't really a question; it's more of a point, and it kind of goes back to what you talked about with your perception being reality. You know, we have the data to show us that fishing license sales has been relatively stagnant, right? But then, you know, all you hear from people is, well, fishing pressure is insane. So to me, those two things they don't correlate. You know, if fishing pressure has increased substantially over the past X number of years, you know, why hasn't license sales gone up? I guess that's just more of a point than a question, unless you have an answer to that. And then two, it's like if funding is the shortfall here, and it doesn't sound like you know, legislation wise, you're going to be able to get licensing fees up, which in my opinion is asinine. I mean, everything else in the world increases. There's no reason that something like that should not, if the cost of everything else relative to what it takes to produce muskies has. You know, how can you get people on board to help out with that shortfall? Because I feel like there's probably a lot of Wisconsin anglers that would put forth some sort of money, and I don't know if it's enough to make up that shortfall, but you know, we sit here and buy $60 glide baits and stuff like that. You know, you probably could pass on one of those every year and say, hey, we can put more muskies in our waters. And I think most people would do that. I think not for sure on that, but would like to think so.
Those are some really good thoughts. And I think, you know, a lot of things that get kicked around when you're talking about this particular issue, one of which I hear all the time is we should have a muskie stamp. And I've talked about this in the past too. And based on how the other stamps work, in my opinion, if they work like the other ones, a muskie stamp would actually result in fewer fish available to stock. Because, for example, the trout stamp The trout stamp is a mandatory stamp for fishing in trout streams. Trout streams are designated in Wisconsin. Our musky lakes aren't truly designated, right? So you don't have, it'd be difficult, first of all, to wrangle the logistical and the legal part of designated a lake, a musky lake. And in order to fish on that lake, then you have to have this stamp, right? So if it worked that way, then you'd have to buy this thing to fish on Lake XYZ, right? But the downfall is then the only money that gets used for that, i.e. trout. So the money we use for trout habitat improvement and trout stocking only comes from trout stamp revenue. We don't get any other outside money, other than like if a Trout Unlimited group wanted to donate money or something like that. And that's something that has worked really well with muskie groups. And I've been involved as a contact for the Muskie Clubs Alliance for the whole time I've been working. Basically for the last 20 years, I would go to their meetings twice a year. And a lot of those clubs that are involved with that have purchased fish either to stock on behalf of the department, so they buy outside fish, or they've given us money to buy forage for the fish that we already stock. So they've done a really great job of trying to help out in that respect and kind of doing what you're talking about, like passing up the $60 glider. Hellhounds aren't $60, are they?
No.
No.
Well, in a while, but why would you need anything else? Anyway,
Yeah.
just kidding. I digress. Anyway, so like there are mechanisms that folks already do and groups already use. The stocking one is a little bit trickier because we have a genetics management plan, so you have to get the right stock or the right genetic stock to put in on the landscape, especially in northern Wisconsin. Southern Wisconsin is not as difficult, but there has been a lot of examples of how various clubs have helped out, and it's really a great thing that they've been able to help out with.
And then also, I didn't mean to pick on gliders. Still buy your Conklin, still buy your Hammer Customs at the Wisconsin Expo. But yeah, no, I this is all good information because I think the stocking thing to me seems to be a big frustration with a lot of people. So it's just good to understand kind of where the people that are doing the stocking are coming from, and if there are ways to help. You talk about kind of pulling levers to increase funding. I just think people would, for some. I feel like people would get on board if there was a way to help out.
Yeah, and we've seen that across the board, and I'll tell you this too. When I talk to fellow biologists around the state, area biologists or county biologists, to a person, there's really nobody out there saying, "Hey, I want fewer fish." Like when I was a inland biologist, I started a muskie lake down here by La Crosse. It never had muskies in it before, and we started stocking in 2006. And at that time, our quota system was really interesting. It was like, ask for whatever you want, and the hatcheries would try to provide it. And that's when we had a fairly good budget and not as many constraints to our hatchery system, right? So say a biologist requested for 100,000 muskies, like our hatchery would try to produce 100,000 muskies. Now it doesn't go that way, mostly because of budgets. But the other part that we're trying to do from a scientific standpoint is to make sure, much like your investments that you may have, we want the best return on our investment. So in order to stock a water body now, part of the muskie team charge was to develop some criteria to prioritize stocking instead of being willy-nilly and be like, oh, we're going to put 9 muskies in Anvil Lake. The question then becomes, do we need to put 9 muskies in Anvil Lake? Right. So when the biologist says, used to be Steve Gilbert, it's now Eric Wegleitner, but when Gilly used to say, hey, we're going to stock Anvil with 9, and the muskie team was like, wait a second, is that really worth the amount of gas it's going to take us to drive up there, to drive back into that crappy little landing and put 9 fish in?
Yeah,
and
for one guy to catch it on a freaking crawler,
right? And who's
At a
fishing there?
campground.
If there's 4 anglers that fish there for muskies all year, it's definitely not worth it, right? So we have to look at it like that. When you get into these budget situations and you get into this number situation where you have less money, you have fewer fish, you need to maximize where those fish go. So like the eagle chain, that's a no-brainer. It gets tons of use. It produces great fishery. It's pounded all summer. We got to keep stocking that one. That one's easy. The tough ones are the ones that are kind of like people's secret lakes or their favorite little lakes where they try to get away from people, which is what I do every single time because I hate people. But like those are the ones that are tough. And when anglers are on the landscape and they see, they go to their favorite like little honey hole, and they look online and they find out, oh, my little favorite little lake hasn't been stocked in a long time. They get upset, and I understand why that happens. Like it's a natural thing. I look at it a little different. It's like, wait a second, if it was my money, I wouldn't want to waste it on these couple little places that don't usually get fished by too many people. So we have to look at it that way as a department and kind of maximize our return on investment. So all those things kind of come around in a whole suite of choices that had to be made over time. I mean, I want more muskies too. Believe me, if it was up to me and I had the purse strings, there would be no walleyes stocked at all.
Seems like there's plenty of them up here. I've seen reports from other people and
I don't
stuff.
care if there's walleyes or not.
Cut them off for 10 years. They're good. I'm curious though in terms of like the genetic codes or whatever that you guys have to follow, like why in northern Wisconsin can't you stock spotted or I know like in Hayward there's some weird rules with what's stocked. It can only be the Chippewa strains. Like where does that all start and why can't it be changed? Or I mean, how hard is it to change that sort of law?
I'm trying to insult you guys by this, but you're too young to know. So like when I started, even before I started, there was some folks that wanted us to stock a whole leech lake fish in Wisconsin because they said they get bigger faster, and that's what they wanted. And so what happened over time, this is about 2000, was like the apex. And what happened is like Minnesota for many years, they didn't have any idea what to stock. They were stocking these shoe pack fish that generally don't get over about 36 inches. But they stocked those because they assumed them to be like the native musky from far northern Minnesota. Like they were, if you don't know anything about shoe pack lake, it's a landlocked, there's two little lakes there. They're landlocked. Those fish naturally reproduce. And they had been stocking those all over the place. But after they did it for about 10 years, they're like, no, these fish are tiny. They're not getting big. Like, what's going on? So then they started exploring Leech Lake as a brood source because that was another natural reproducing population that they had. And then they figured out how to catch those fish and then started propagating those. Well, there was about 10 years or so where the switch happened and nobody knew about it. And so those lakes all got stocked, and nobody, or very few people, knew that they were getting stocked with muskies. Well, they put muskies into a bunch of lakes that didn't necessarily have muskies. And they had this founder effect where they grew really fast and got really big and were really dumb. And then the double cowgirl. So Brad and Carrie designed probably one of the best baits ever. And it hit the landscape at the same time. And those big dumb fish could not stay off of them.
What a perfect storm.
Right. So our anglers aren't dumb in Wisconsin. They just, they saw what was happening. They, the word got out, and they started going to Minnesota and catching these fish. And like, I fished Mille Lacs at the early days, and it was insane and stupid. Like I told you before, I don't like people. And when you go over there and there's a line of boats fishing a weed bed on the North Shore, it's cool as long as everybody's going the same way. But that one guy sees a fish and turns around, it's pure chaos. And I've never wanted to kill people so much in my life when a bucktail landed 2 feet from my buddy's boat. I told him we have to leave or I'm going to kill that guy. But I digress. So like all of this happened, right? And so a bunch of anglers in northern Wisconsin were like, oh, there's no big muskies in Wisconsin. We got to change. We want to stock these fish. And so as a scientist, we go, okay, well, let's figure out if there's any precedent for this. Let's figure out if there's something wrong with our fish indeed, or if this is a perception, right? So we did a bunch of genetic research projects where we took genetic samples of our fish in northern Wisconsin. Meanwhile, there was a bunch of other genetics work that has been done on muskies. And when you looked at all of it as a whole, we found out a few things that were very pertinent. First of all, there was an assertion that our fish were all mutts and they were all inbred and that they had no genetic diversity and had the propensity to grow or not grow at all. We found out that that's not true at all. There's a high degree of genetic diversity in many of our waters up north. There's an example of Lac Courte, which used to be a trophy lake way back in the day. Some of the biggest muskies in northern Wisconsin came from there. And the interesting thing about, we did genetics work there, and despite stocking from all over the place, the original, the Coudray genetic persisted. So the fish that we stocked did not contribute to the gene pool. That, and among other research projects, there's some done in Illinois, some done out in St. Lawrence. There was some done in northern Wisconsin and in Iowa. Basically, what they found is that the native genetic survived the best. Not that fish stocked in there wouldn't survive, but they did the best. And since we had this long history of muskies in northern Wisconsin, we were not, as a department, willing to change our whole genetic makeup to something that might not work across the entire landscape. It might work here or there, but there's a significant difference in our geology, in our water quality, in our water chemistry versus Minnesota. So there was scientific, data-driven reasons why we didn't want to just scrap all the Wisconsin fish that we stocked and go to Leech Lake fish exclusively, right? I definitely understand the desire to have those fish, but what happens if we stock them and they don't survive and then we end up with nothing? Who gets yelled at then? Then we do, right? So we use the best available science, and we did the things that were asked of us by anglers. Some of them didn't like the answers that they got, right? They said our fish are mutts and they don't have any genetic diversity. That wasn't true. So we actually have data that we had 2 different grad students that did projects on that show that that wasn't the case. They also said that our fish were mutts because we stocked, from certain waters, and we stocked all over the place. What happened in most situations was that any native genetic that was there persisted. The stock fish didn't contribute. So we do have a really strong genetic background in the upper Chippewa and the upper Wisconsin. And if you guys are familiar with who Tom Gelb was, he caught some of the biggest muskies in modern time in Wisconsin. They were 50 pounds, and those are upper Wisconsin genetic. So it's not like if you could scoff at a 50 pounder, right? Yeah. And 50 pounders are rare, no matter where they swim. And so if the question is that we just want to put the largest individuals in the water, we would bypass Leech Lake anyways, and we'd go right to the St. Lawrence, because the largest muskies in the world live in St. Lawrence River. And there's a bunch of different evidence. There's a lot of evidence of that. So there was a whole bunch of things that happened, and our job is to use science to produce, results for our anglers, and that's what we did. So it wasn't what everybody wanted, or it wasn't what some of the anglers wanted anyway, but that's how we got to where we are now. And so the bottom line is, local genetics typically survive and grow best in their local environments, especially if you have that ability. Now, places like, Tennessee, or, like where Cave Run is, and places outside the Muskies native range, it doesn't really matter what they stock. In Iowa, same thing. When they started their muskie program, they got a bunch of fish from us, and they got some fish from the Ohio River. They got fish from all over the place, and their program is doing just fine too. But they've developed a stock that grows there over time, and we already had it, so there's no need for us to change.
It makes sense. I couldn't imagine Leech Lakers being put in the Eagle River chain, compared to a lot of the different bodies of water, in Minnesota, obviously, are just much larger, deeper, and clearer. In general, it would just be kind of crazy to see a full stocking of leechers in Cranberry Lake, where the deepest point of the lake is just a little over 20 feet, and that's just only in a couple holes.
And Leech Lake fish have been stocked in Wisconsin. In some places they seem to do okay. In some places they really didn't. They got stocked in Lake Wissota that's kind of one of my home waters. My folks live right by it, and I fish it all the time. It got stocked for over 10 years. The local club spent, I want to say this, if I remember right, it's about $120,000 stocking them. And when they did a genetic analysis out there, they found 2.9% of the fish that they captured were of Leech Lake origin. And that, to me, that wouldn't be a good return on investment. Now down in Madison, they seem to be doing a little bit better. Thus far, the latest genetic analysis I saw down there, and we continue to do this all the time, is collect genetic components, is they're about 10% of the population down there in Lake Monona. And they seem to be doing fine down there. But I would say when I look at Lake Monona, it's more similar to a lot of the Minnesota lakes that I've fished in terms of water chemistry, water quality, water color. At least some of the lakes that I fished in Minnesota, they're very similar. So I'm not saying that Leech Lake fish can't survive and they can't produce a fishery. It's just the odds are not in the favor, and we already have something we know does well in our water. So when you consider all of that, that's why we stuck with our genetic management units and continue to kind of stick to those. Now, we do have the situation where if you're in the native range, which is like the northern third of the state, you have to follow those genetic management units or those genetic management systems. In the southern part, you don't have to. So they can stock in the southern 2/3 of Wisconsin, pretty much south of Highway 10. There are no restrictions on genetics.
So with that said, if they ever lifted that restriction, I mean, could you see a world one day where they start putting leech lakers in like a trout lake or a fence lake or something like that up in northern Wisconsin, or would just never really enter the realm of possibilities?
I mean, I don't know. I can't see a reason why Wisconsin DNR would want to do that, especially when, there's been high 40-pound fish caught out of trout. If I guess I look at it like this, like if we were really trying to grow the longest fish, we could do that genetically by, taking eggs from the largest individuals. You can do that. But the risk you run is that then you may run into a situation where those genetics then have a fault and say they're not as disease resistant or something. And then if you do it just with a couple big fish, because you never catch enough big fish to use like 30, which is what you try to use now to increase that genetic diversity. You never catch enough of those big pairs to get there. So then if you use 2 pairs to propagate all your fish and they're prone to VHS or some other disease, then you lose them all. And when you're thinking about, it's easy as an angler to go, well, I want big fish and lots of them, right? But you're not beholden to what happens if something goes wrong. And that's where we have to live. And it's not popular, right? Like I would venture to say that I'm probably not very popular with a lot of folks because of some of these things. And that's okay. Like I don't do this to be like everybody's best friend. I do this to create, solid fisheries for you guys now and then down the road. Like I did it to make fishing better. And I think I can go to sleep at night saying that I did that. And I'm not necessarily worried about the fact that I didn't make everybody happy.
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, we were so excited to have you on because we wanted to learn about these things, right? And I think sometimes as anglers, you make a good point. Like we definitely don't think about the exposure side of stocking, like the downsides of if things go wrong. It's something that I know for sure has never entered my brain before. Like it seems so simple, right? So it's good to hear it from you kind of on how you guys like think about these things because it makes a lot more sense.
We would not stock Leech Lake fish in Green Bay because that's not what's right for the Great Lakes. Like a lot of people think that they're the same, but they are not. They're distinctly genetically different. When they do genetic analysis, Great Lakes fish are far and away different than Leech Lake fish. And I can even go further than that. When you look at, say, Georgian Bay, which is a famous place to catch giant fish, those Great Lakes fish even differentiate by the river in which they spawn. So if you look at the north shore of Georgian Bay, there's a bunch of different rivers. I like the Spanish and the French, and there's all these different rivers up there. And each one of them has a distinct genetic stock that spawn there. And then in the summer, when they're done spawning, then they come out and mix in Georgian Bay proper. So like when you start looking at genetic makeup of these fish, if you really study it and look at it, you understand why it's important to use local genetic stocks because they're the ones that have evolved over time to be best suited for those environments. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be equal in terms of length or girth or ultimate length or any of those things, right? But it's unrealistic to think, oh, musky fishing is great on Lake of the Woods. Let's go get some of those things and bring them down here. And if any of you guys have fished Lake of the Woods, you'll see fish with multiple different color patterns on that lake. You'll see clear fish, you'll see barred fish, you'll see spotted fish, but they are all distinct to their genetic of Lake of the Woods. So that's a kind of another layer of this. When people see the coloration on a fish, they automatically assume that they think they know the genetic makeup. That isn't necessarily true, because the coloring of the fish is a phenotype. That's not necessarily linked to genetics. It's just like I have gray hair now. It used to be brown. Some people have red beards. Some people have red hair. Some people are blonde. That's the difference there. We're all humans, right? But we all have different genetic makeup that make the phenotype, the outside appearance, look different.
Interesting.
Interesting. Yeah.
Environment also
Never-
plays a role in the coloration of fish too. So
Mhm.
For sure. Yeah, I got something to ask about genetic diversity, because I've heard you use that in past podcasts. I don't know what my specific question would be, but basically you're saying you want them to be as diverse as possible. You're saying, are you saying that you want to get, many eggs from many different females from that particular broodstock lake, or am I thinking about this wrong?
that's correct. What our goal is in stocking, when we stock fish, we look for at least 30 pair. And the pair part is kind of weird because that's actually 30 females, 30 to 36 females, and then we pair it with up to 3 males. So if you considered, if you've seen muskies in the spring, if you've been on lakes and you've seen them paired up, a lot of times there's a female with multiple males. And if you don't see the second or third male, they're probably there. They're probably really close. And what happens is when that female decides to release her eggs, a lot of times multiple males will get in there, and then they create that diversity naturally. We're trying to mimic that with our hatchery practices, and we're also trying to be realistic with the number of fish that we catch. So we look for 30 to 36 females and pair that with about twice as many males, because we want to maximize that diversity. That diversity helps us with survival. It helps us with age. It helps us with disease resistance. All those things become less of a threat the more diverse you are. So it's the same reason you don't want to have kids with your sister, right? If your population is so small that you're having kids with your sister, usually stuff doesn't end up well.
Sure.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So,
That makes sense.
I mean, it's possible you do create a hunted giant. I don't know. But generally, it's not a good outcome when we think about those things. So we're trying to maximize that protection against any of the outside things that may be detrimental to the fish. So that's why we want the most genetic diversity. So when we look at genetics and when we're looking at Georgian Bay, the alarming part about that is any one of those populations in those rivers could be in jeopardy if something happened to the spawning location. If something happened to, a couple of the females that are involved in it, because a lot of these populations aren't very large. So there might be 100 individuals in a spawning population. And if something happened environmentally or with their spawning location, then their natural reproduction could go away and you could lose that whole genetic component, right? And that's what has happened in a lot of our northern Wisconsin lakes. We don't have as many naturally reproducing populations now as we did 20 years ago. Most of that is because of habitat degradation. And when you think about a lot of the lakes up there, when 30 years ago, there weren't as many houses on these lakes and there was more natural habitat. There were better weed beds. Because what happens, most people buy a cabin, they want to have a nice swimming beach. They pull out every piece of wood. They get rid of the veg. They put a big dock in with a boat lift, which many times is not beneficial to natural recruitment of muskies. So, or anything else really. I mean, bass do okay like that, but that's because they're a different kind of spawner, right? They're a nest garter versus a broadcast spawner.
Right.
Thanks. So, man, you kind of answered my question that I was going to talk about with just natural reproduction in general, but it just kind of sparked a thought. You talked earlier about some of those, call them off the wall, kind of pothole, really good musky lakes, the ones that you like to fish, the ones that we certainly also like to try and find and fish. Typically lower boat traffic, lower houses on the water. Do you think that those lakes are sometimes hidden gems in the sense that they might not have the stocking, but they do support natural reproduction a lot better because of that aspect?
The end part, when you said might have much better natural reproduction. I'm not sure that's the case. Because generally, I always say this: muskies suck at making more muskies. They're a long-lived fish. They are not, something like a bluegill that guards its young. They have lots of eggs. They're a smaller individual. They generally don't live very long. Those species tend to have what we call high fecundity. That's high reproduction, and they also have high mortality. With muskies, we're looking at the other end of the spectrum, more like, I mean, sturgeon are an extreme example, right? They live hundreds of years, and they suck at reproducing as well. So they also broadcast they don't have any natal care of their eggs, so they put them there and they hope good things happen. Getting back to those little lakes, that's like when I was up there, I spent almost all my time finding those type of lakes. I didn't have like a really nice boat. I had a really great 12-foot. It was like 100 pounds, Sea little boat. I could put a trolling motor on. Dude, I could carry that thing anywhere. I can't tell you the number of creeks I drug it up. I can't tell you the number of times I got yelled at by property owners saying you can't be here. I can't tell you the number of like little tiny gems that I like drug this thing back into and were some of my favorite places to fish. Mostly because if I don't get yelled at, they were pristine. But even in those situations, it was rare to run into one of those lakes that had like tons of fish in it. Normally, those lakes have better habitat, and even though they had better habitat, they still didn't have high musky numbers. They tended to be really low density, but there was some freaking tanks there, right? There was some hammers, and that was the reason I went there, right? I didn't go there if I wanted to go catch a bunch. I'd go to like Wildcat or some of those other high density lakes, Little Arb or whatever. So like that's what I was looking for. And they do, some of these systems, they have really low levels of natural reproduction. And I would say most of our waters in northern Wisconsin have really low levels of natural reproduction. That's evidenced by all the tigers you see up there. And I'm not talking about back in the day when Kentucky was full of them, because those were all stocked. But
yep, they were.
Like that's what you see. What the evidence of that is that those tigers that you're starting to see all over the place, and it's been that way for like 10 years. It seems like there's been a pretty good number of tigers showing up in a lot of these northern Wisconsin lakes. That tells me that there's somewhat suitable habitat. Now, there's a huge difference between northern pike and muskie spawning, and the biggest difference is that northern pike eggs are adhesive, so they when they're fertilized, they grab onto like any vegetation, and they're held up off the bottom, where muskie eggs are not, and so muskies suck worse than pike, because what happens is if they're on like a soft bottom area, those eggs hit the bottom, and a lot of times that bottom sediment is anoxic, and they basically suffocate the egg. So what we found in some of the spawning studies is that if you have these soft bottom bays that they're trying to spawn in, and there's a lot of wood, then you have better reproduction, because if the egg lands on the piece of wood, it survives. If it lands in the muck, it dies. But a northern pike, right next to it, the egg sticks to anything and stays up off the bottom, and therefore survives. So there's so much that goes into this. It's a really difficult thing to try to explain. But it's something that's important. I think it's important for folks to understand about musky reproduction. There probably is some in almost all of our waters, but the kicker is we provided such good fishing for so long in terms of in the form of stocking. So we've artificially inflated these fish populations to a point where it makes us happy to go fishing for them, right? It would suck to be a musky angler if it took you 3 weeks to catch one, right? There'd be a lot fewer of us if that was the case. And so by stocking fish, we've decreased the time between catches, made it a fun thing to do. And then also we've made it so that with size limits and catch and release ethic, we've made it so that, our egos are caressed as well once we catch one of those really nice ones.
That's super interesting. I'd never, I don't, did you guys know about the egg thing? Never crossed my mind to think like, oh, if it sticks to something, it's better. It might suffocate. Like that's super cool stuff to hear.
All the eggs taste like fish, though. I can tell you that for sure.
I know I heard in an older podcast you talked about the tiger muskie basically, and saying that correct me if I'm wrong, they tend to produce better on springs that are cold and then a rampant warm up so that you get the males still male pikes still lingering around when the female muskies go in to reproduce. And then another thing that I heard from you, um, as well, is that pike and muskie habitat of spawning is different. And now that you're saying that with the amount of you know, houses going up and shorelines being developed up here in the Northwoods, do you think that some of the habitats now are coming together and why there's still great tiger muskie populations? Do you think there's more tigers than back in the day, or do you have any opinions on that by chance?
That second part is really interesting. I'm going to start out with that and maybe go back to the first part if I remember. But like, it
Mm,
seems to me that there are many more tigers now, but I don't know if that's a function of social media. So, like, if
sure.
you're talking
Yep.
20 years ago, we didn't have Facebook, we didn't have Instagram, we didn't have the social media that everybody could brag about the things that they caught. So, I know
Hmm.
back at that time, tigers were being caught. I mean, I remember seeing a 4 foot tiger on trout back in the day that I really, really, really wanted to catch, and I didn't. But like that, that fish was there naturally. Um, and so it's hard to say. My perception is that there are more tigers. The tricky part is that's one thing we don't have data on, because tigers
Hmm.
don't really, they're not very vulnerable to our gear when we're trying to sample these fish populations. So when we try to sample muskies, our best piece of gear is a fyke net. It's a color trap net, so it's a series of funnels that the fish swims into. Um, and muskies are vulnerable to that gear. They don't seem to mind them. The biggest problem there is if the fish is too big and the net's too small, they don't like to go in. Um, and an example of that is on Green Bay. We actually had to make larger fyke nets to capture those individuals, because what we found was that they'd get up to that net, the opening was too small, and they'd back out of there. Whereas a lot, and that might be our problem all over the place because we don't tend to catch the largest individuals all the time. But spawning location is really interesting because it varies from water body to water body, and I my speculation on that is that it's based on the genetic makeup of that population. They've evolved over curtain with local conditions to reproduce in certain different situations. So we're talking, if you want to talk about Trout Lake, when I worked up there, we did a population estimate out there. Like, man, the year I'm not going to remember the year. It was a long dang time ago, early 2000s, and we netted for a couple weeks, and it was interesting out there. Those fish appeared to be spawning just outside the bulrushes on like that sand bottom, and
Hmm.
I found that in many situations, muskies do and can reproduce on those kind of sandy bottom areas. They're not traditional like
Interesting.
muck bottom, dark bottom bays. It was really on the sand, and that happens in a lot of places. And then in other places, it'll be either up a creek, up a river, or in some of these classic soft bottom bays is where they try to do it. So like Escanaba Lake, if you've ever fished there, that's one of our research waters. That is a lot of data on it.
Hmm.
They like to spawn in the soft bottom bays there, and they were introduced to that system, and since they were introduced, they've been naturally reproducing since then. So they got stocked way, way,
Interesting.
way, way, way back, and
No
that's the only
kidding.
time they've been stocked.
That's
Interesting.
interesting because we fished there before and we've actually caught a tiger out of there that was not tagged. It was small. It was very small. So that's
There's
very
always
interesting.
tigers in Escanaba. They always
Yep.
mingled during the spawn. But yeah, that
Yep.
timing thing is one of the critical aspects to increase the odds of having tigers. If you do have that rapid spring warm up where it's cold and then ice goes
Okay.
away and it gets warm really fast, so that both species are in there doing the same thing at the same time, because it's really
Yeah.
driven by water temperature. And if you had that spring where you get even a foot of pull off of that ice, those pike will be spawning in that, because their spawning temperature is like 40, 38, 40. So they're in
Hmm.
like right next to the ice. And if there's a foot of shoreline open, they'll be spawning there. But if you have that situation where the ice holds on, all of a sudden, boom, it's hot, wind blows ice off the lake, water shoots up in temperature, both species are in there. I think that's really the key for producing some natural tigers.
Sweet.
Well, I man, this has been awesome. I have a question for you, and I don't expect you to give me a black and white answer here. Um, So, and you feel free to punt on it. But so when we talk about stocking and the natural reproduction, and we've kind of touched on a little bit now with like the advancement of the angler, the technology and everything like that. I mean, do you see how we're kind of going in the direction with the advancement of technology, pretty much just saying forward-facing sonar at this point, because that's really the big thing people mostly care about. Do you see that as a huge threat, I guess, moving forward, as far as what we have right now for fisheries in Wisconsin?
Well, full disclosure, I have forward-facing sonar, and I use it. I don't use it how some people are upset about it, but it's very similar to when the AquaView camera came out, and it's also very similar to when the bottom line sonar finally came out with, or first came out with side imaging. You hear a lot of the same. I'm old, right? So I hear, I've heard all of this. Like I remember when bottom line came out with the first side imaging technology where you could see out to the side of your boat like crazy. That was going to be the end of fishing. All the fish were going to go away. And then, that probably was the same with the Lowrance black box back in the day. I'm not that old. But like, AquaView cameras come, it's going to be the end of fishing. And then you get to maybe the Vexlar. It's going to be the end of fishing. And if you've been paying attention, what tends to happen in situations where there is some risk or might be risk or there's perception of risk is most often folks like me, they change regulations to reflect that. Now, when we're talking about muskies, since mid 90s, really nobody's kept muskies, right? Like I say the mid 90s, it was probably even before that, but Muskies Inc. did an awesome job of really, getting everybody on board, much like the bass world did where, bass fishing, NASCAR bass boats and big tournaments and catch and release. In fishermen was a big part of that where, catch, photo, and release. That ethic in the muskie world really buffers it from really any of these technological advances, right? So when you're considering what factors affect that, it's really just hooking mortality, because the only thing that could change would be hooking mortality. If that technology causes an increase in capture, like if that's the case, and it seems to me that most anglers who are anti forward facing sonar say that it does. I'm not sure personally. And I don't think anybody has the data to support that either way. So I'm not going to tell them they're wrong. I'm just saying my perception maybe isn't the same as theirs. But if that increases substantially, then that 5% or 5 to 7% hooking mortality could be significant in certain situations. It's not going to be across the board. It's not going to affect every lake the same. It's just like a regulation or stocking doesn't affect every lake the same. So could you have an isolated impact on a lake? Absolutely. Especially if those fish are being caught and mishandled or perishing one way or another, right? If that occurs, then you can have problems. Generally with musky anglers, we don't kill very many fish. I mean, you do if you catch a bunch because it's just probability, right? If hooking mortality is 5% and you catch 100 muskies, you're killing 5 whether you want to or not. That's reality, right? None of us want to kill them. I don't think people with forward-facing sonar are out to kill more muskies than people who choose not to use them. That's my opinion. I mean, I use it to learn my habitat, because in my 30 years of muskie fishing, if I can find the right habitat, I know the muskie is going to be there. So once I find that habitat, I don't need it anymore. But I do think it's cool to watch their behavior and how they interact with different lures. On that note, I'll just a little bit of rant here. The coolest thing that I've been able to see, and this is backed up by my master's work, which if you're not familiar, I did walleye muskie movement project on the Manitouist chain. I had 36 muskies with radios in them, and I followed them for 2 summers. So I got intimate knowledge of those.
Real quick, one of the coolest videos. If you guys are listening to this, you should check it out. It's awesome.
I've watched it multiple times. I was actually going to ask a question about it.
Unbelievably cool study.
probably going to answer
Thank
what I
you,
was going to
thank you
ask
guys.
anyways.
I appreciate that. It was awesome to do. And aside with that, I wouldn't have been able to do any of the muskie work in that project if it weren't for Muskies Inc. and Muskie Clubs Alliance of Wisconsin. They provided funding for every single one of those tags. And if they wouldn't have done that, I wouldn't have been able to do muskies at all. So I thank them tremendously for that. And I try to give back all the time by, telling them what I learned about these fish as often as I can. So, like a lot of people, the perception is, you have this spot. So say it's a sunken island or whatever, and you saw a big fish on it and you go and fish there and you don't get a follow. A lot of people are like, oh, that fish left. What forward facing sonars taught me is and my radios, that fish probably didn't leave. It's just not interested at the moment. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you might come back in 10 minutes and see that fish because it's changed its attitude. That's one thing that forward facing sonar has really taught me is like these fish each individual is an individual and it has its own attitude and it reacts to a bait or a stimulus in different ways. And every single one of them is different. So,
right.
Bottom line, if it's killing more muskies, it's not great. But at the same time, if it's allowing anglers to catch fish, that's not a bad thing either because that's the goal. Right? I got this weird saying is like a fish that's never caught doesn't exist. Right? So fish out there in the eagle chain, if it lives its whole life out in the middle and no one ever fishes out there, it doesn't matter that it's out there. And it wouldn't matter if it was 98 pounds because no one would ever catch it. It only matters when someone catches it. And in my job, like really, that's the only thing we want to provide this fishing opportunity, but we really want people to catch them because without catching them, none of the work that we do matters.
Right.
So for the rant.
Yeah, I know. That's totally good. That's why we get people on, just bombs away or rant. It does, it's all good. But what was I gonna say about this? It's I mean, like with live scope, like yes, we've seen probably increases of fish catches and overall, I know you were kind of saying like the catch mortality, basically that about 5 or just over percent that you're going to catch are probably going to die from just being hooked. But I know you've talked about ways to prevent that, and another thing with the live scope that would help prevent that is I know that there's been talks about people fishing for them too deep. Maybe we can get into that if you have any insights or data on fishing too deep, because that's the one thing that's opened up a whole realm. You're saying like, oh, there's maybe a fish in the middle of the lake on the Eagle River chain, which if it's sitting in the middle of the basin in the Eagle River chain, that's 12 to 15 feet. If it's sitting in the middle of the basin on Trout Lake and it's sitting 60 feet down in 100 feet of water, it could have different effects, barotrauma, this and that. I'm getting onto a whole different side of things, but basically with fishing muskies too deep, I guess what I'm trying to ask is there kind of a too deep, maybe? I'm just kind of rambling at this point.
Well, let's talk about barotrauma is interesting because Esocids are physostomus fishes. That means that they have a direct connection between their air bladder and their gullet or their throat. So I don't know if you've seen muskies burp or gulp or blow air bubbles out as you release them, or if you've seen it with lake trout. Lake trout do it too. They're physostomes. They have the ability to burp air to regulate that air bladder. When you're talking true barotrauma, it's relative. Generally 10 meters or 30 feet is 1 atmosphere of pressure. And freshwater fish, most of them, physostomes especially, some fish don't handle that as well. Walleyes don't handle it well. Perch don't handle it well. Crappies don't handle it well. Bluegills and basses don't handle like over 30 feet. Just because you were to encounter a muskie at 30 feet or shallower doesn't mean it's automatically going to live when you hook it. But it also is not a death sentence. And what I'm trying to say is these physostomes, they should have no problem based on their physiology and the biology behind physostomous fishes. They should have no problem with the ascension from 30 feet or less. When you start talking about greater depths than that, I would, aside from very special situations like maybe lake trout eaters, your muskies are never going to be below 30 feet. Like, it would be a rare instance where you'd have a muskie that was below 30 feet. I actually talked to a gentleman who would fish Crow Lake in Canada, and that's a lake trout lake. He saw a big return on his graph down 100 feet. He dropped his bucktail down, and he actually caught the fish. And then he watched it go back to the bottom after that encounter. But that's like winning the lottery. You know, having a fish in 100 feet of water and catching it, and then, you know, so that, you know, when you think about the biology of the fish, those one-time events really, in the grand scheme of things, don't matter. I know it doesn't feel good if we see, you know, a big dead fish or even a small dead fish that may or may not have perished due to whatever. I think the bigger thing is potentially something that we can't really control a lot of the times, is like where the fish is hooked. Right? As anglers, we have to accept some degree of responsibility, no matter how you choose to fish for muskies, that we're going to kill a few, right? If you hook those fish in the gullet, it doesn't matter what lure it is. Some lures tend to be hooked deeper than others most of the time, but like, it doesn't matter if you, and you're not trying to hook them there, but if you do, or if you hook them in the tongue, it seems to be a much worse place to hook a muskie in terms of whether or not that fish is going to survive or not. If you tear that gullet, that fish is probably not going to survive. It's going to swim away. It's going to look like it's going to survive, but over time, it's in the next year, it's going to probably get an infection and die. And I've seen enough fish that get hooked in the tongue. I can't tell you why. This is one of the things that I really would love to learn some more about. That tongue area seems to be really susceptible, in a really bad spot to hook fish. And they don't always die right away, but they generally die. So those are things we can't control, right? We have to accept that if we're going to fish for these things, you know, we're going to kill a few. And I've told this story before too. Like, I killed a 47 incher that was built like a railroad tie on Lake of the Woods. I had no choice. If I could have kept it, I would have. But it wasn't 54 inches, so I could not keep it. And I had to watch, and I had it on a single hook spinnerbait with a trailer hook. And at the time, the front hook was in the corner of the mouth, but I don't know where that back hook was. And I think it must have got it in the tongue. I don't know, but like, it was alive in the net. I pulled it up for a pick, tried to let it go, and you could see the color go out of the fish, and it was game over, right? And, you know, I felt terrible about it. And, you know, what am I going to do, right? But like, that's the risk we all run in doing it. There are things you can do to reduce the chances of hooking the fish deep. But at the end of the day, we're trying to catch fish. And, you know, because muskies are basically 100% catch and release, if a couple die, it's not the end of the world. And most of our fisheries can sustain some sort, it's not really harvest, but some mortality. It's not going to ruin anything. Now, I know it doesn't feel good, and it makes it seem like I don't care. That's not true. I'm just trying to be real with everyone.
Right. No, that's good. I mean, I'm glad it actually kind of, you know, went there with that question. Like I said, I wasn't really sure where I was going with that, but another thing I was gonna ask you about with, you know, muskies that have died, you know, from, you know, whatever causes they may be. Maybe it's an overhandle, hook too deep, too hot of water, you know, whatever. Do you know what's maybe I've heard it somewhere. What's like the percentage that they float and they don't? Because you know, I've heard that from people. They're like, oh, well, you see one float, there's 10 that just, you know, sunk to the bottom that you never saw or whatever. I don't know. I've heard things, you know, so I don't know if you have any insight on that, because, you know, it's all hell breaks loose when one muskie in the Northwoods is floating. So, and typically it's after a tournament, mind you. I'm gonna put that out there. It's almost
Well,
always
I guess
after a tournament weekend.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think anyone has the data to answer that question for you.
Okay.
What I would say is based on, environmental conditions, the warmer the water, the more likely you're going to see something float. And that's just simple
Okay.
gas exchange and gas expansion, right? Um, if a if you hook a muskie, let's just say you're out in July on trout and you're fishing some deep rock humps, and the thermocline's down at about 18 feet, which is where most of your muskies are going to be. You catch one, right? And it swims back down to 18 feet. And when you caught it, you didn't know, but you hooked it in the tongue inadvertently. You didn't know that. When you got the fish in the net, the bait maybe came out and you had no idea. That fish swam off back down to its thermocline where it was before, and then eventually dies. Well, where it's down there, it's not going to probably float because the temperature is going to be cooler. There's going to be less gas expansion. And most likely at that point, that fish is going to then sink to the bottom and no one will ever see it again. Most of the time that I've seen dead fish are either in the middle of summer when it's real hot, or I've seen it just after ice out and during the spawning period, because the spawning period is really stressful for muskies. When they're spawning, they're so keyed in on that spawning system, or that the spawning act, that they don't feed and they just do that thing. It's like salmon, right? When salmon swim upstream, they don't stop because there might be a grizzly bear there. They just keep going because it's driven. It's innate. It's an on-off switch that's been turned on. It says I have to go back to this spot, and they go and do it regardless. And all fish are like that. They have to do it. So when they're doing it, and broadcast spawners don't defend their eggs, so they do it and they go back to their normal life, right? So, but when they're doing it, they're focused on that thing. And I'm kind of on a rant, but you're talking about floating fish. No one has that data. Mostly likely it's related to gas expansion.
Gotcha.
Real
Yeah.
quick, Gus, before you ask another question, because it's something Brian and I have talked about this. How hot is too hot, Jordan? How hot is too hot? Because you look on Facebook, I thought it was 80, now it's 77, now it's 75, then it's 73.
Yeah, we need the right answer here.
Now you just shouldn't even fish for
Just
him because
not
it's always
fish at
too
all.
hot. Yeah.
Just don't fish at all. So I've talked about this a whole bunch. The science is pretty good. It's not as broad as I would like. There's been 3 really significant studies, and I'm a little biased because I was co-author on one of them. Essentially, when water temperatures are over 80 and increasing for a period of time, so leading up to 80 is okay if it's going up, right? If it gets there and then increases or stays there for a long time, what happens is your mortality increases somewhere between 30 and 50%, right? So your normal mortality on hooking, or like hooking mortality, is in that 7, maybe 5 to 7%. So it increases 25 to maybe 40%. However, you're not going to catch those fish if they're stressed. So if they are not comfortable, they will not bite. That is like, I'm not a hatchery person, but I've talked to enough hatchery people, and I know about hatchery raised fish, which are no different than wild fish, in that when they get stressed, the first thing they do, and what that stress could be anything, it could be water temperature, it could be a disease, it could be any number of things. The first thing that happens is they quit eating. And so, like, when our hatchery folks get to the hatchery and they notice there's a bunch of food on the bottom of the raceway, they are freaking. They have to figure it out right now, or the whole lot's going to go. So they have to figure out what that stressor is, release that stress, so that those fish will start to feed again. So how hot is too hot? The fish are going to tell you. I've said multiple times I don't quit fishing, but I can tell you that my success when the water's really hot most of the time really sucks. And I have not had any fish like die after I've caught them. Things you can do to minimize that. So if you're going to fish and you think that there might be some risk, don't net it. Try to release the fish in the water. Unhook it along the side of the boat. Don't take it in for a picture. Don't measure it. And that goes back to anytime you want to reduce stress on a fish, you minimize your handling. It's not just in warm water, right? So some of the handling tips that I always tell folks is like that time from hook set to that fish is out of your hand. You should try to minimize that amount of time every single time you catch a fish. Now, you guys have caught a bunch of fish. When you first started catching muskies, you weren't as good at that as you are now. And it's a gradient, right? So like the other thing I like to stress is like, don't hammer people too much, because you never know if they're just starting out and they don't really know, and they might be a little scared about handling these fish. Like in general, muskies are tougher than we give them credit for. A lot of times, we hear people, they're like, oh, they're just, you look at them wrong and they're going to die. No, that's gizzard shad. Gizzard shad, if you look at them wrong, they die. Muskies are tougher than we give them credit for most of the time. Generally, if you're really concerned about water temperature, if the water temperature's been hot for a long time, 80 or better, you might want to just pack it up, because first of all, you're not probably going to catch anything. Second of all, if you do, your chances of killing that fish is increased 25 to 40%. So that's what the data tells us. That's not what my experience has shown me. But, again, I would rather rely on the data than my experience, because like I said before, my experience is my reality, right? And that happens with a lot of people. I like to live in the world where I get as close to factually as possible. So like generally, if it's 80 and it's been 80 or above for a long period of time, you might want to, I would say don't fish for anything. I would say go swimming, because, I've also heard like, oh, go bass fishing. Well, we don't know that it doesn't kill all the bass too, right? Or maybe go pan fishing where you're going to keep some for a meal, right? So if you're going to do that, if hot water is bad for muskies, it's probably bad for the other stuff too. So maybe consider that too. That's the part that kind of gets missed. And let's not make the fact that we don't want to fish for muskies a detriment to other species as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good point. That's good point to go panfish, where you can actually just keep them and eat them, kill them anyway. You don't have to worry about trying to release them.
Yeah, get a meal, right?
Yeah.
The first time I was ever on Lake of the Woods was back in like 2001. When I showed up there, it was my first time. Couldn't be more jacked. I had some really good spots from one of my friends gave me on a map, and get there and the water is like 82. I can't tell you how many fish were in 1 inch of water, and we're smacking the crap out of everything. Now, the fact of the matter with that situation was that the surface 3 inches was 82, but down a foot, in reality, it was probably like 78, 76. And muskies' preferred temperature is about 65, so they actually like it a little bit cooler than that. But what tells me that they were just fine was the fact that they were cracking every top water and every bucktail we could land within about 6 inches of the rocks. And, they had no problem taking off after we caught them. So it varies in every single lake and every single situation. Lakes that stratify tend to buffer themselves. And I would suggest the other thing you could do if the water's really warm is you could try fishing a little bit of those stratified waters. They tend to be a little lower in mortality based on the science. And I actually thought that would be different. I thought the mortality would be higher yanking those fish out of like 70-degree water, bringing them up 15, 18 feet to the surface, messing around with them and letting them go. But the scientific study that was done on Stonewall Jackson didn't really show that. So I was actually surprised by those results. So that could be another option. But in general, what's going to happen if you do go fishing, the muskie community is going to crucify you. So you have to have thick skin if you're going to decide to fish at that point, above now, what is it? 70, 71? I don't know. 76.
I don't know. Pick
78. Yeah. Just wait till summer and they'll tell you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I ask because I legitimately want to know, because it's like, it seems like you talk about it's all just anecdotal evidence from a lot of people that say their opinion. And it's like, well, I'd like to know, you mentioned the one study that's been done, but it's hard to say. I mean, this is a hard fish to study, it just is. So I like talking to people that have kind of dedicated their life to it, because it feels like we're actually comfortable talking about these topics because we're talking to somebody who's done it for the last 30 plus years. You know, it's been good. I've enjoyed
So
it.
like the three studies that were done, I'll just summarize them real quick. There was a pond study, and the ponds were hot. We had one in Wisconsin, there was one in West Virginia, North Carolina. I want to say Virginia, maybe there was like four. We didn't have any muskies die in Wisconsin that we caught that were, but when it was over 80, but we had fish die that we never caught. And we found out with our temperature loggers that our pond actually was spring fed and is stratified. It was only 9 feet deep, but the bottom was like 70 degrees or 68 degrees or something, and the surface was like 82. So we didn't have mortality from hooking, but we had mortality in general, and I think that had more to do with the size of the pond because it was pretty small. Some of the stuff in the Carolinas, though, they had temperatures up to like 86 and like hooking, and
Boiling.
those fish died at a much higher rate. But the caveat there is they also had the handling time of those fish was much longer. So it's like a cumulative effect. And that's why I say, if you're going to do it, the fish are going to tell you, first of all, the fish are going to tell you how they feel. If they're biting, then you're probably okay. But if you're concerned at that water temperature, don't put them in the net. Release them at the side of the boat. Don't take a picture. Don't measure them. Get them out. Stop that stressful experience as quickly as you possibly can. And that kind of goes into some of the handling things that I like to kind of promote. And for many years, I was the guy who hung over the side of the boat for the hero shot with those beautiful, the cool boat side release pictures. And I don't do that anymore. And mostly that was a self-reflection upon I videotape all my stuff and kind of just watching what the fish was doing when I was holding on to them. And I see this on all kinds of videos, right? And I'm not trying to bash on anyone in particular. So if you hold the fish beside the boat, like whatever. But the goal, if you're trying to release that fish, should be to get rid of that fish as fast as possible. Now, having said that, I measure every one because I'm a scientist and I write all that stuff down. So I don't care if it's 24 inches long or 94 inches long. I'm going to measure it. I don't weigh anything, but like I minimize the amount of time from the hooking point to the time I let it go, and that includes I don't hold them over the side of the boat anymore. I do what I call like a modified St. Clair release. Like I don't know if you've seen the St. Clair trollers where they'll just be like, and they shoot that thing out and kind of torpedo it in. When I first saw it, I'm like, I can't believe that, but they would have impacts with the number of fish they catch. If that was killing them, they would see the impacts, and they're not. So I actually just do kind of a same thing. I actually just slide the fish in head first, as long as I'm not in like 1 feet of water, right? If I'm in, deep enough water, I'll just slide them in and let them go. And if you start to do that, you'll actually see how fast these fish like kick and start to right themselves and take off. Some of them you never see. Some of them linger a little bit, but like I've watched too many people hold their tail. And what I can tell you for sure is when your hand is on that caudal peduncle, that tail of that fish, they are still stressed because that is an unusual feeling for them. They're not used to having anything touch them on the sides. And so the stressful experience continues as long as you continue to hold the fish. And too many times I've watched like that fish wants to go. You see it start to kick, you see the fins start moving, you're like that fish wants to go. And then, homeboy is still holding the tail of that fish. I'm like, just let it go, let it go. And so I just like to, I'm not trying to tell anybody what to do. I'm just asking if you're willing to think about doing something a little different, letting that fish go quicker than possible, as quick as possible, right? So that you stop that stressful experience.
Yeah. That's a good one. I want to say you might have been the first one to say it in Backlash a long time ago, because that one stuck with me. That's definitely one that I think done without even thinking about it for a while now, and then after talking about it again now, it's like, oh yeah, I've looked back at because now we film a good bit. We've been running GoPros and all that good stuff, and looking back at footage and stuff, I realized that a lot of times I'm letting go of the fish and just looking at them, and they're just sitting upright. Even if they're just sitting upright near the boat, you can still look at them. I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but I just it feels good knowing that that's a good thing to do. And it's a very easy thing to do.
Increasing the stress level, right?
Yeah.
You stop that at least increase. Now, I'm not saying the stress goes away immediately, because there's been some blood work studies that show that it maybe doesn't, but at least you're not continuing to increase it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those fish, just get rid of them. And obviously there are caveats to everything, right? So the warmer the water, the quicker you want to get rid of them. When you're catching them late in the fall, man, and there is no more difficult thing to hold on to than a muskie in the spring when we catch them in our fight nets. You haven't fought them. They beat the crap out of you. And I've handled thousands of them doing that, right? And there is no tougher fish when that water's cold than a muskie. So like when you got cold water, you can get away with a lot more, heroes. Like, and I'm not telling anybody they can't do the hero shot, right? Like if they got a really nice fish, they want to have that boat side thing, you go ahead and do it. But just kind of be conscious about the attitude of the fish, how long the fish has been, in your possession. If it's been in your possession for a long time, maybe forgo the hero shot for the betterment of the fish. Just think about. All I'm asking is for people to think about these things and maybe consider what they're doing. Look in the mirror and be like, "Hey, could I do this better? Is it possible?" Like, you don't have to give me credit. Like, I'm not. That's not what I do this for. Don't say Jordan said to do it. Just do it, right? Because we're looking to try to save as many of these fish as we can.
Right. Is there something that I've seen in some places, and maybe this is just by local Muskies Inc., where we could almost put up flyers or posters at boat launches for fish handling? Like we don't have to preach like, hey, don't keep them, like, or here's the size limit, 40 inches, but then right underneath it just say, but don't keep them. But maybe something where we can have a good flyer that it shows these, good catch and release things, because I think as much as, we do this a lot. We talk to a lot of people who musky fish a lot, but then there's still some, average anglers out there where we get, reports of people who are in tournaments who are handling fish for over 15 minutes. And even some reports of in tournament fishermen with fish in the bottom of their boat for a set amount of times. And you'd think, without all the information out there that, people would get that, but possibly just a simple flyer at the boat launch could help. I've seen uh I've seen that at like trout stops, like public stops for trout fishing. Um, but maybe that would be a benefit.
Absolutely. I think that some of that stuff is already being done. I know Titletown has been doing a really good job at a lot of the shows and many of the local like sport shows and whatnot, not even just muskie shows. Like those guys got a whole spiel and handouts and they got fish to, so they've been doing an awesome job about that. And I do know that there's other opportunities for those type of things. I think Muskies Inc. or even any muskie club or maybe even your guide service could look into, creating some sort of one page flyer that's easy to understand. Like I haven't seen any of that out there yet. But I do think there's opportunities because at almost every boat landing there is some sort of kiosk or signage. Like maybe not all that in Vilas there's fewer of that, but like and when it comes to tournaments, like I don't do tournaments. It's not my thing. But I would think that organizers would do that, although I'm not sure any of them do. I would for sure think that they would say, okay, well, if you're going to fish in this tournament, here's what we call proper handling. Now, having said all of that, if you're one of the folks listening to this and you've had muskies in your boat for 15 minutes or whatever, like, look, no one wants to do that. I got to assume that those folks had some issue with something to keep that fish in the boat. Like either they didn't, if it was something like they didn't have the proper release tools, well, that's pretty easily fixed, right? If they, if something else happened where, I mean, it was hooked and they got hooked to something else and you couldn't get them unhooked or who knows, like if they didn't have the proper equipment, that's one thing. But if they're trying their best and the fish is in their boat for a long time, like I can't fault, like they're trying their best, right? I wasn't a great muskie handler when I first started doing it, right? I'm a lot better now, but am I perfect? No. I mean, I let one fly a 46 incher fly out of my hands, and I was so sad because it bonked its head on the side of the boat. Like it swam away. I don't know if it's live or dead, but like it it went crazy, and I just go, and the thing hit the side of my boat. And that was, that happened last year. I was disappointed with that result, but like I didn't try to do it. So like I think there's some of that. I think there's a real opportunity though for some groups to really step up, and I think in general they do a pretty good job.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm curious. I just have like more of a situational question for you. I know you were talking about how if you have like a week-long stretch in the summer where it's 90 degrees and the water temps are like now consistently 80, these fish might shut off their eating habits or they kind of get stressed as a byproduct. Um, I mean, what can you tell us about, let's say that following week, the floor drops out, it's highs of 60. How do these fish react? How do their eating habits react to like a total opposite swing in water temps? Maybe it has to do with more of like pressure or, barometric pressure, storms rolling in and other things. But I mean, will they continue to, does that add to their stress level? I guess is what I'm trying to ask.
But if they're stressed from the environment, in this scenario, it would be water temperature, right? If they're stressed from that, as soon as that stress is relieved, they're going to go back to their normal job, which is in the summer, it's just eating fish. It's
Eating
like
a lot.
feeding. So like I really simplify muskies. To me, muskies, I mean, they're easy. They spawn in the spring, and every other moment after that, they're trying to survive, which means eating. And as it gets into fall, they eat more because the females are trying to build up the egg mass, and the males are trying to build up that gamete, the sperm mass as well. So yeah, I love cold fronts in the summer. I would take one, every other week if I could get it, because in my experience, those can be some of the best days that you can have on the water in the summer. And a lot of times you don't need a big swing in water temperature, at least surface water temperature, to have that happen. Um, the funny thing is, and it's never mentioned, is like each sonar unit measures temperature different. I don't know if you have multiple units on your boats, but
That's correct.
if I use my Garmin, I always got lower water temperature than my Lowrance or any Humminbird that I've seen. So, it's an interesting concept, right? Well,
Interesting.
my Garmin says it's 78. I'm good. Oh wait,
Yeah.
my Lowrance says it's 80. Which one do I listen to?
It has
That's
been nice
interesting.
a few times with like having the live pull down and my transom because I run all Garmin everything, and then our live scopes unit is on a ice fishing bundle, so we either have it in the boat or not. And it's sometimes nice to know what just a foot down below the transom transducer is compared to the live, and it's always a little bit cooler, and I've definitely seen fishing on other people's boats with Humminbird and stuff. Yeah, they do read warmer. So uh if I'd want a true water temp reading, I'd probably get a specific thermometer for the fact. Because I've definitely in situations read you know, lower water temp than others. Because I guess I would say I think
That might
last year
be
up here I saw 80
that might be one
twice.
of the things that you could consider. This is maybe more of a fishing tip than a sciencey tip, but I have an actual temperature gauge it's a corded temperature gauge, and
Mm-hmm.
it's delineated by feet. So I actually measure temperature on occasion when I'm out there fishing. And, I said before 65 is their preferred temp. So maybe use your temperature gauge and drop it down till you find that level.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, if you're trolling or if you're casting open water, that can be an indicator of where you want to have your baits, or at least you want to make sure that they're above that level so that the fish see it, right? So like that can give you indications with really warm water if it's really warm too far down, or if it's just a little bit at the surface. Maybe it's the first foot or
Yeah.
two, and then below that it's really cool. And rather than saying, okay, well, I'm not going to fish, or say you have guide trips booked, and you can explain to them like, look, here's the deal. Yeah, we got really warm water at the top, but down 2 feet, here's what it is. We're dropped down to now we're at 72. And so these fish that we're going to fish for now, we're going to fish down in that level. We're not going to fish that 2 foot of slop today. We're going to go fish some deeper stuff and then minimize that risk of increasing mortality.
Gotcha.
It's
That
pragmatic, right?
totally
You have
makes
to,
sense.
like, as a guide, Gus, you know, if it's too hot, that's money out of your pocket, right? You only have so many days to guide during the summer. Like you got to make the most of
Right.
it. So like I'm trying to figure out ways to say that, hey, it's not the end of the world. Use the scientific information that's out there to make it so that you do what's best within your confines of your job, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. That would be something I'd highly want to get, so that I could know the temperatures. Because honestly, there were maybe just things that over time I learned from trolling a lot where like, I'm not going to say them out loud, but I have a couple depths of certain lures at certain times a year where like I put the lure at this depth and it's going to get bit. Or the fact that even when the water gets, really warm and maybe on a cooling trend slightly, those very, you know, lakes that stratify higher up, it's you only go down a foot or two and it changes, temperature really quickly. It may be, 78 on top, but it drops quick. Like those fish, you think they're going to be deep, but they're not. Like, there's some bites where the water seems warm, but we can find fish in 3, 4 feet of water, no problem, because they're still very comfortable being there. Um, yeah, that would be interesting for, yeah, an open water bite, and then also late fall as well, um, which is kind of like a full circle to what I wanted to like explain, or I think I was trying to explain with, how deep is too deep and stuff like that. And I know you're talking about then hot water, where um, something that I actually wanted to ask on that before I go into anything else is that at least in my opinion, 80 degrees is probably only relative to like where you are. Like for example, an 80 degrees at Eagle Lake in the trout water area surface is probably a little different than 80 degrees on Cave Run, Kentucky. Um, just as it would be like, because it's almost maybe what the fish are used to seeing. Down there, those fish are used to seeing really hot water all the time, every single year. Whereas up here, say on the Eagle River chain, those fish are used to a hot water period for a little bit. And then you go to Canada, it's the extreme. I mean, those fish see hot water for a couple weeks, maybe a week. I don't know. I mean, the season's so much shorter. So, I going off that, I still really like all your answers with the hot water, and then the the deep water stuff. It's just funny because I've heard people talk about like old timers trolling. They have all these old. I'm looking at this big legend plow that our buddy Owen got us in that Hunksmith, the skips exchange that we did, and we have a legend perch bait. We like it, but then I've never had this plow, and I'm pretty sure this thing can get down like 30 plus feet. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, so, but they're telling us not to fish that deep. It's like, why does it get that deep? I've heard stories of people fishing, baits 30, 40 feet down and 40, 50, 60 feet of water. But they typically come from people who are fishing Georgian Bay, St. Lawrence, just places out there. So, and I'm sure there's different and I know there's so much diversity up here in northern Wisconsin where there's probably lakes that there is oxygen pretty deep. Because there's lake types, aren't there? I don't know what
That'll
they're,
vary from lake to lake too.
yeah, because there's
Not
like
all
lake
of them have
types.
oxygen below the thermocline. Some of them do, some of them don't.
Sure. Just by
Yep.
oxygen levels. Do they measure the oxygen in those pond studies for hot water?
Yeah. They were hatchery ponds, so a lot of them were aerated. And
Okay.
ours, we had monitors. We monitored ours every week. Yeah, plenty.
Interesting.
Oxygen wasn't a problem. Um, and
Okay.
generally, oxygen is not a problem. Like I've heard people talk about, the water gets warm, it holds less oxygen. Well, that is generally true. Like the temperatures we're talking about most often, the water is still super saturated with oxygen when the water gets warm. So the mechanism by which the mortality occurs is probably not oxygen level.
Okay.
Um, it's definitely something else
Hmm.
that dictates that. So I was, I mean, if you want to put a number on it, like 30 feet is probably as deep as you're going to want to target muskies. Um,
Hmm.
I just it's not easy to fish deeper than that unless you're jigging really. And
Right.
there are plenty of examples where, like you said, Georgia Bay, St. Lawrence. As soon as you said plow, I'm like, oh, okay, we're going to go to that spot. We're talking about Georgia Bay where they troll these shoals that might be shallow in some parts, but they're definitely not all trolling real shallow, and they don't seem to have big issues out there. Especially when they're catching these fish that are probably 35 years old and 60
Yeah.
pounds or whatever.
Right. It's just unreal seeing some of those videos and
Every
what
lake
they're
is
doing.
different, right? So like a really
Yeah.
kind of a cool example that I'm familiar with is I also have a cabin in Rusk County by Ladysmith and fish Lake of the Pines and Connors some. And Lake of the Pines is like super shallow, and that thing gets like a bathtub in the summer. And I wouldn't, if I was going to go fish in July and August, I wouldn't fish there. I would go over to Connors and fish, because that one is a lot cooler, a lot bigger, a lot deeper. It's just a different morphological lake. And so that's where you can make those decisions when you have those options. Some people don't, but where you're at, you have unlimited options to choose the best lake for the fish and for yourself.
Gotcha. So you're kind of, I mean, I know you don't want to clump it into a tiny little conclusion, but basically, so that I can wrap my head around it, is that when the water does get warm, maybe not quite scary warm, but just warm-ish, and I should be, considering, way, way less handling, of course, that going to possibly a deeper, clearer lake is maybe better or better off, going over like, going after a deep weed edge fish or a rock bar fish or something like that.
I think that's safe to say. And then if you could take, if you had your temperature gauge and you could actually confirm that was the case, then you're even on better footing, right? I think a lot of the folks that are talking about water temperature, and telling people to stop fishing, I'm not trying to say they're doing anything wrong. Like what I just think it's the easy thing to do, right? It's the easy thing to say is once the water gets to 78, stop fishing. Well, okay, well that's easy to understand, right? But it's not really the whole story, right? On top of that, sometimes
Right.
I think people just want people to stop fishing so they can go fish.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, yeah, there's plenty of
Maybe,
these
I don't
people
know. Maybe.
that they're fishing stuff. I don't know.
Does feel that way at
Kind of,
times.
it's
Yeah.
like, don't troll because trolling's cheating because they don't want you to catch the
Yeah,
fish
or
that they're
don't
catching
go
trolling.
Yeah.
don't go to that lake. It's beyond its heyday. Yeah, we get plenty of that, and we've heard plenty of that, and we found out from ourselves that it could be true, after going to some of these places that
It could also
get
be
bashed
bullshit.
on. Grass is always greener.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you guys got any more questions for Jordan here? He was very gracious with his time. I think we're running at like $1:45 now. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, no disrespect to the other people we've had on this pod, but I might have learned the most this podcast. That was some great stuff.
yeah, that's why I was
Just
so
because
excited.
maybe it might just be outside your element, gentlemen. Like you guys know how to catch fish, right? It's taken me a long time to gain this knowledge. I mean, 25 plus years plus grad school and
Yeah.
undergrad and grad school and experience and learning from other folks. And I'll never know it all. I'll always continue to learn. And that, to me, that's the cool part about, looking at muskies and looking at fish in general is just to continue to learn new things and hopefully, improve fisheries for folks. That's really what I've been trying to do for this whole time.
Yeah, that's awesome. I feel like so many casual anglers just show up and cast a rod, catch a fish, and they just assume that fish has just kind of been plopped into this lake and it's been there forever. But like, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes with the DNR and stocking and everything to make these places fishable. So it's cool to hear from your perspective and to learn it more in depth.
For sure. Like I said, there's nobody that I work with that's like, yeah, we want to make fishing worse. I mean, never have I ever heard that. So
that's good to hear.
Right.
and everybody I work with fishes. So like,
Yeah.
why would we want to make it worse for ourselves? And honestly, for myself, it's like because I can see the end of the light at the end of the tunnel. It's like pretty soon that's all I get to do, and I can't wait because I'm pretty happy with how things are going. Like, can't make everybody happy, but I think we're doing all right considering the circumstances anyway.
Yeah, I'm glad to figure out a little bit more of the whys behind some of these, generalizations and blanketed statements. I think it's been super, I don't know, I think it's been super educational for all three of us, and hopefully it will be for everyone that tunes into this because, yeah, I just think there's a lot of, information that's out there on social media now that gets talked about over and over again. And I just feel like sometimes people pick up on these talking points and then just they keep regurgitating them without any real, data. Like you talk about, you want to actually understand why these things are happening. And I've always been curious about that too. So we really appreciate your time. This has been a lot of fun and super informative.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. Appreciate it so much.
All right, well, we can't thank Jordan enough for his time tonight to come on and talk muskies, and not only just muskies, but the data behind them, hard evidence, studies, the whole biologist standpoint to things. So it was really refreshing to talk about that, and I thought it was a great discussion that we had, and hope everybody enjoyed it. But guys, I don't know if we want to discuss here some of the takeaways that we had here. I mean, I was, very happy. There was a couple times I totally had some smooth brain things going on and asking some questions that maybe rambled too much, but maybe that's just because I'm a little bit sick. But I still was very, enlightened in a few of the topics.
Yeah, I thought it was really cool to hear. I mean, I've dived into some of the like stocking numbers and stuff, a little bit about, obviously we learn about the muskie and kind of their habits and climate they like and everything, but never dived in as in depth as he was getting with us, especially hitting on their natural reproduction, why it just doesn't work successfully up here. He's got a lot of experience. He got his master's in it, so I just feel like there's a lot more to touch on with him in the future.
Yeah, I tried to go into the interview with like kind of pretending like I didn't know anything at all about musky fishing because I just kind of wanted to learn from a clean slate. And man, I think if we sat here and did takeaways, we'd probably be here for another hour talking about some of the various topics we covered in that interview. But
100%.
I think it's one of those interviews that just kind of spoke for themselves and or spoke for itself, I should say. And hopefully everybody learned a thing or two. I know I surely did. I know you guys did as well. So a lot of fun chatting with him. Hopefully we will have him back on in the future. He's one of those guys that like if you guys have more questions or things that maybe you wish we would have asked, feel free to DM us and we'll kind of bank those for a future interview with him because I know I could have asked him a handful more questions that it just started to get to the point, we were rolling at about an hour 45 with him and took up a lot of his, time. So we appreciated that a lot. And I think we'll have plenty more to talk about in the future. But it is getting late here, fellas. I know I know we don't have much to talk about in the world of musky fishing, but Gus, you did post a clip on your socials this week that's for one reason or another, who knows why, but the Facebook algorithm gods decided to toss it right in the jet stream of the general public of Facebook.
I was gonna say I'd like to
And
call it the general admission where just anybody can get in and do whatever they want, The-
and
How many
so
That's what I
that
like to
views?
call it.
it
I think
ended up getting
almost
like
700K.
Oh my God.
It's getting
The
up there, and
environment.
I think over
my
2,000 likes and 80 plus comments or something like that, which, a lot of them are probably just replies by myself that are very highly sarcastic, trolling, um, some would say, basically rage bait. And I was having a lot
Yeah.
of fun with it with some people that I'm not quite sure knew a whole lot about musky fishing, just posting a cool clip of a cool encounter with a muskie. I could explain that situation in full on detail right now if need be, but it's a 12-second clip in slow motion and it doesn't tell the story. And apparently, we got some absolute,
It's
oh,
yeah.
experts of the sport telling me pretty much what to do. Actually, a couple people saying that if they were in my situation, lo and behold, this is crazy. they would have caught the fish if they're in my sit. Could you
Oh
believe that?
yeah,
Can you
easily.
believe that?
It's
I
crazy to
like
me.
it's
It's crazy
funny.
to me that Facebook, it's just a different breed of social media users on Facebook. I mean, you see it on every platform, but like the fact that people will just be aimlessly scrolling their Facebook Reels or whatever they're called, see your clip, and then be like, "Oh, I gotta let this guy know that he did it wrong." I mean, like what? I mean, are you that bored? Like what? So if you guys are looking for some entertainment while you're laying in bed tonight or whenever, go to that Facebook video and just scroll through the comments. I glanced at it
It's
earlier
pure
today and I
gold,
was just
man.
cracking
It's
up.
pure
Yeah, there's
gold.
a few that I just never even addressed because I turned my notifications off,
Oh, there's a lot. Yeah.
and there was like a one night, or there was like a 20-hour period where I didn't look at it at all, and Max texted me again because I thought it just kind of cooled off, and this was like when it was still flying like that, the jet stream was still rolling, and there was some choice words by some people on Facebook that just don't care about, the interweb trail, and it's pretty funny.
Yeah, I was cracking up, man. It just found that side of Facebook. Like we always joke about it on the Musky forums and stuff like that, but we've never had any clips of our stuff like kind of find that like mainstream of Facebook, if you will. Like I don't even know if it's fishing Facebook at that point. Like I think it's just like
No.
in general viral videos of just like you see
Yep.
on your when you're scrolling your phone, like you see all these viral videos and the comments are just like cesspool worthy. But it's so funny to like actually have it happen to one of your things and then see kind of like what goes down. I mean, nothing makes people more mad, I guess, than just having a fish in the figure eight. I don't know why it was
I
so
don't know.
triggering to some people. But it was good
It's
entertainment, and man, it's not for the faint of heart to do numbers like that. I think we found a good sweet spot in the community we're in with how many people listen and interact with our stuff on a daily basis. We have awesome listeners that are really great to us. Um, yeah, to see the other side of it, like, man, people are really dumb. Like it is crazy. So had to
yeah.
bring it up because it was pretty funny. I think if we all had some more energy right now, we'd probably be laughing a little bit harder and reading through them. But we're all kind of
Yeah.
tired and whatnot. But it was good stuff. Very entertaining.
Yeah, I need to knock back a 30 mil of NyQuil here and should, zonk me pretty quick. And it's good to see that little 12-second slow-mo of, you know, losing a fish or not catching a fish does more numbers than catching a fish. So, all right, Facebook and Instagram, watch out. I got plenty of lost fish to get out there that I don't give a rat's ass if people see or not. It's the reason I, film anyways, is to learn from our mistakes. And sometimes totally screwed up, sometimes musky blackout, and sometimes it was just the fishing gods were not on our side that day, and he did everything right, and maybe that's why it all went wrong. Who knows? It is too funny. So get a good chuckle. It's the video that's on my account, just Gus Manty, my public Facebook account, is the one that went viral. It was posted on Instagram too, and it went, you know, semi or sorry, I meant to say Instagram, or did I say? I'm losing my marbles right now, but
Yeah, I mean, it just caught that Facebook jet stream and it just
mhm.
brought out some funny people. It gives you a good laugh. I mean, I was cracking up. Like Brian said, we were texting about it. We were all geeking out pretty hard. So, but I don't know.
For
I
sure.
I think we can put a bow on this one here tonight, gents. I don't know about you guys, but
Yep.
I'm ready to hit the hay.
Yes, I am too. I'm just gonna give a quick update on the next show. Um, Milwaukee, I'm going to be there. I am going to be speaking there actually, and when I know more on that, I will give out the information on the podcast and definitely more specifically the socials. But I would just like to throw that out there just so that people know that you can see me speaking at the Milwaukee Muskie Expo, and I'll be, hanging around probably all weekend. So come say hey. I'm excited for that one. Um, Otherwise, before we sign off here, if you guys want to give us a follow on Facebook and Instagram, Visit, Muskies on Tap. Also, my guide service, Suggs Fishing, SUGS, which is on Facebook and Instagram, and the website, which is www.sugsfishing.com, SUGS Fishing, where you can also see the merch, which as of right now is just stickers and hats. Um, the merch is here. Had a little bit of technical difficulties. We'll leave it at that. Um, I really wish this would have been the one with, a much bigger update, but do not worry. We will have brand new stuff for Milwaukee and absolutely for Minnesota and Wausau. And I know we've been getting a lot of people asking about that. Going to do it for now at the shows only, show special. All holdovers and leftovers, if any, are going to go to the website. Want to give people the chance that are coming out to see us first dibs. But either way, you're gonna have plenty of time to wear your Mott merch before these musky seasons open, if you do have a season. So without further ado, Brian, take us
Alrighty,
away.
everybody. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Muskies on Tap. Shout out to Jordan Weeks for coming on this week. Incredible stuff from him. Incredibly knowledgeable guy in musky fishing, stocking, everything that's to go around in our musky community. Guys, everybody's getting sick this time of year. Make sure to lubricate up, not just on your typical juice, that alcohol, that liquor, that wine, but make sure to mix in some of that emergency, some of that Alka-Seltzer, maybe that zinc, maybe that what's that Zycam? I mean, Gus, what are you gonna be boozing on tonight? NyQuil,
NyQuil.
NyQuil,
Yeah,
NyQuil.
liquid NyQuil.
All right, everybody, lick up on that NyQuil. We'll catch you next time.